Hi there, it's lovely to see you. I'm Lorna and we're reading The Secret Lake by Karen Ingalls, and this is chapter 16, The Return Visit. The first day of September had brought with it grey skies, an unseasonably sharp breeze, and the children stood shivering at Mrs. Moon's back door. The patio garden was a far cry from the courtyard of dappled sunlight they had sat in a week earlier. As she opened the door, Mrs. Moon's face lit up. "Tom and Stella, how nice to see you, dears. Come along in now. It's really quite blustery out there." Tom and Stella stepped quickly into Mrs. Moon's kitchen. The old lady had renewed vigour and a quickness of step they had never witnessed in her before. She immediately directed them through the hallway into a sitting room next door, which was crammed full of dark furniture, covered here and there in lace cloths. A handsome standard lamp in one corner bathed the room in warm yellow light, while a sombre-looking man in an enormous portrait hanging above the fireplace eyed the children suspiciously. The old lady followed their gaze upwards as she stood leaning on her stick. "Oh, don't worry about him, dear," she chuckled. "That's just Edward." Tom and Stella each chose a chair and sat down. "Who's Edward?" said Stella, adjusting the velvet cushion behind her. Mrs. Moon sat carefully down in an upright chair opposite the fireplace. "That's better," she said. "You see, I know I can get out of this one. Ah yes, Edward Moon, dear, my late husband. Such a lovely man." She chuckled again to herself. "You know, we used to joke about that picture. We always said the young artist must have caught Edward on a bad day." She paused for thought, then raised her small wrinkled hand to her mouth. Or was it the other way around? Dear me, I seem to have forgotten. "It's beautifully painted," said Stella, trying to sound like her mother. "Well, yes, of course, dear. Anyway, enough of Edward. How nice it is to see you at last, and especially after my silly upset last week." "What upset?" said Tom suspiciously. Stella raised her eyes to the ceiling. Mrs. Moon smiled. "Well, you know, dear, I wasn't quite myself at all that confusion. Anyway, Dr. Brown seems to have fixed me, and Charlie was brilliant as usual." Tom narrowed his eyes. "I feel so much better," Mrs. Moon went on. "Such marvellous medicine they have these days. Would you like some juice, dears? Apple or orange?" "Orange, please," said Tom, as the old lady rose from her seat. "Yes, please," said Stella. After their last visit, she didn't like to offer help, so instead she cast her eyes around in wonderment at the beautiful pictures and objects that crammed Mrs. Moon's living room. As the old lady disappeared back towards the kitchen, Tom raised his eyebrows mischievously. Then, to Stella's alarm, he jumped up from his seat and started wandering from table to table, fingering the array of silver-framed photographs, trinkets and ornaments that filled almost every surface. This was the stuff of his dreams, a real live treasure trove. "Leave them alone," whispered Stella crossly. She could hear Mrs. Moon pottering about in the kitchen next door, but Tom, being Tom, ignored her, and when he had completed a circuit of the room, he delivered his sister a cheeky grin, then disappeared through another doorway. Stella jumped up from her seat to give chase, just as Mrs. Moon reappeared, pushing a large trolley. On the top shelf sat a silver teapot, blue floral milk jug, teacup and saucer, and 2 glasses of orange juice. On the lower shelf sat a large silver platter crammed with an assortment of biscuits. "Tom," Stella called crossly, her eyes glued to the biscuits. Then she remembered himself. "I'm sorry about my brother," she said, then smiled politely at Mrs. Moon. "He's rather nosy, I'm afraid." Tom appeared at the other doorway, looking strangely embarrassed. "I see you've found my bedroom, Tom," said Mrs. Moon, taking up the biscuit place. "Did you find anything interesting, dear?" She winked playfully at him. Tom smiled awkwardly and sat down. His normally rosy cheeks had drained, and as Stella selected a pink iced biscuit, she couldn't help but smirk that her brother for once had been caught out. "Would you like a biscuit, dear?" "No thanks," Tom said weakly. Stella almost choked on her orange juice. She had never known Tom refuse a biscuit. Everyone paused for thought. Then Tom spoke again. "Where's Harry, Mrs. Moon, and Charlie Green?" He was in defiant mood and obviously didn't give 2 hoots about giving the old lady a heart attack. Stella cleared her throat impatiently, then held her breath in anticipation. "Ah yes, dear Harry." Mrs. Moon leaned forward from her chair with a strange smile, then, with a shaking arm, poured herself a cup of tea. She sat back, took a sip from her cup, then lowered it decisively onto the saucer. As the clank of the china reverberated round the room, Stella and Tom both flinched. Now, as the old lady cleared her throat, Stella knew that she was about to make her announcement. Stella crunched hard on her biscuit and stared beyond Mrs. Moon, trying not to look too interested. As she did so, she fixed her gaze on an old trunk, covered in a white lace cloth, down to the side of Mrs. Moon's chair. As the old lady began to speak, Stella's stare remained fixed on this seemingly obscure piece of furniture, and yet the longer she stared, the faster her heart began to beat. Mrs. Moon started to say something about Harry and Charlie, but suddenly Stella wasn't listening. By now, her cheeks were burning. Her eyesight wasn't bad, but in the dim yellow light, she couldn't be sure of what she was seeing. With her head spinning, Stella downed her glass of orange juice in one and plonked it on the trolley in front of her. "Is there any more juice?" she blurted out. An awkward silence filled the room as Stella felt her cheeks turn purple. She then gave Mrs. Moon the most enormous grin. This rudeness wasn't like her at all, but she just had to get a look at that trunk. With a look of surprise, Mrs. Moon began to raise herself from the chair. "Why, of course it is, dear. Help me up, will you, Tom?" "Shall I get it?" Tom offered politely. Stella looked at her brother in astonishment, first refusing biscuits, now offering to help someone, exactly what had come over him in the last 5 minutes. No, dear, I'm fine," said Mrs. Moon gently. "You sit down, I shall be right back." "Hey, Stella!" Tom could barely contain himself, but Stella didn't hear him. She was already at the side of the trunk. "Look, Tom, look!" she whispered excitedly. Though worn in places, the gold lettering was clear enough, and yet, as she took the deepest of breaths, Stella could barely believe what she was reading. But there it was, clear as daylight. Miss S.E. Gladstone. Tom was quickly at his sister's side, and as he crouched down and read the words, a broad grin spread out across his face. "Sophie Gladstone," Stella gasped in a whisper. "Mrs. Moon must be Sophie." Join me for Chapter 17.